Next, let's talk about the real emerging use case that we're seeing now, and that's ecosystems. And so what ecosystem, the intelligence is for us really, it's a combination of the two practices, my practice and Allan's practice. We're looking at the relationships between the IT services companies and the consultancies and the cloud and the software companies. We're looking at headcount, revenue estimates, again, making apples to apples comparisons by taking data that's out there publicly, data that we're able to model, estimates that we're able to make, and applying them into our own taxonomy. Welcome to TBR Talks, decoding strategies and ecosystems of the globe's top tech firms, where we talk business model disruption in the broad technology ecosystem, from management consultancies to systems integrators, hyperscalers to independent software vendors, telecom operators to network and infrastructure vendors, and chip manufacturers to value-added resellers. We'll be answering some of the key intelligence questions we've heard from executives and business unit leaders among the leading professional IT services and telecom vendors. I'm Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst, and today we'll be sharing the audio of a recent TBR Insights Live webinar session on the TBR use case for Alliance professionals with Allan Krans, Principal Analyst for TBR's Cloud and Software Practice. If you'd like to view the visuals from this presentation as you listen along, you can do that through the link in the show notes. So we're going to cover a lot today, and it's going to be all about how our clients use technology business research's research. So we're going to talk about benchmarking. We're going to talk about the highly customized data and analysis we do. And then we're also going to dive a little deeper into cloud and the cloud practice that Allan runs. And here you can see it's myself and Allan today. You can look us up on LinkedIn if you want to know the dirty details about us and our backgrounds, but that's who we are. And this slide really is the what. What does TBR do? When someone asks, what do we do? This is it. This is the market we cover, and this is what we produced. And so the rest of this session, now that you know who we are and what we do, the rest of the session will answer the why, or the for what question. That is, why do we do that? Who uses it? What are the reasons that people come to TBR? So we'll start with the first traditional TBR use case. And our firm has been in business for more than 20 years now, and we've always done benchmarking. It basically is taking reported and estimated data, feeding it into our own taxonomy, which allows us to make apples to apples comparisons amongst like companies that have similar business models and are competing in the same space. So why? Why do benchmarking? Primarily because it provides a foundational set of data, an agreed set of data points. It's for internal discussions. We've heard that it's been used to help win internal battles because it's a third-party view, it's a neutral view, it's an informed view, and it's also much deeper than that. It's more than just what's public. It's also what we are able to model in terms of our estimates on whatever the metrics are, whether it's revenue or headcount or the rest, and then it's normalized by business units so that you can make those like comparisons from peer to peer. Our benchmarks are also longitudinal. As I mentioned, we've been in business for more than 20 years, so we've got all this massive amounts of data behind us, and we can use that longitudinal view to more accurately understand past performance, but then also look at trends and begin to plan for what's coming. Who uses our benchmarks is primarily competitive intelligence and strategy development within the clients that buy our benchmarks. We also see benchmarking used by alliance management teams. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And back to the taxonomy, I just want to hammer this point home because I think it's really important. So it's not just reported data that's sort of collated and turned into charts and graphs. We start with what's reported, but in order to make useful comparisons, we need to model the data based on our experience, our analysis, a variety of inputs and factors. And we also go beyond just the data to tell the broader story that's behind the numbers. So the benchmark isn't simply an XLS deliverable, it's an entire set of research and analysis that, again, tells you the story behind the numbers, and it makes it relevant to our readership. And we dive into individual service lines. Just in IT services, and in my practice in particular, we break one of our quarterly benchmarks into ITO, BPO, CNSI, and all that. So it's across the top companies that we cover. We do that by service line. So if that's what our benchmarks are, then let's take a look at what some of those use cases are. We're just going to describe a couple examples of those use cases, and I'll go first, and then I'll let Allan chime in as well. The number one use case for our benchmarks, for TBR's benchmarks, are quarterly business reviews, QBRs. A large number of our clients tell us that they use the benchmarks to inform their QBRs, often extracting service line specific metrics, service lines that are important to them, and extracting specific competitors and peers, and then feeding that data into their own QBR reports. We've been told that the TBR benchmarks save tremendous amounts of time for the people who are tasked with preparing QBR materials. Also, back to a point I made earlier, our benchmarks eliminate those disputes around what is and what isn't happening in the market. We're able to have a definitive, authoritative view on the metrics, on the results, on the performances of these companies. So that feeds into the QBRs. And then it's also helpful for planning because clients know that this benchmark data and analysis will be able to support their decisions and help calibrate the next quarter's decisions. And I recognize that benchmarks are backwards looking, but knowing that they're coming helps our clients plan how they're going to measure their own performance and the trends that can show all the way into the next quarter or so. One particular use case I'll mention is a global management consultancy that uses our management consulting benchmark to bring to the firm's leadership a common understanding of their immediate peers and their partners. And then the same firm uses a customized by us data set to extend that understanding of their performance to competitors that are just outside of their immediate space, but are still critical to their ecosystem. So they are quarter by quarter looking at the performance of their peers, their near peers, and their immediate competitors, but also those companies that we cover that are just outside of their immediate competitive space. Allan, a couple examples from cloud.
Yeah, first, before we dive into that, I just wanted to kind of highlight the bubble graph that we have up here and on the prior slide. Just the level of information that's presented, the story for the entire market, really, not just at the top line, but there's a growth aspect, there's a operating margin aspect. And that's for companies that some are public, some are private, some are, just in that one specific market. Some it's a segment of their overall business. And so standardizing on that and showing not just, one financial view, but really a lot. You could spend a lot of time just analyzing each of these graphs. And I think that's, kind of a standard for our benchmarking. It's a financial benchmark that really standardizes different segments of the market, puts everybody on the same playing field. So in terms of, how we see some of the cloud vendors using this, and specific to alliance and ecosystem activity, it's not just selling it, competing in a certain segment. It's looking at the connection to hardware for hybrid deployments. Most customers are going to have a mix of deployment methods. So being able to look at what's going on in the hardware segment of the market, we see that use case a lot. And then extending into the services realms, looking at the managed services landscape, for instance, the size, growth across different segments of that, and being able to prioritize and evaluate the types of ecosystem strategies and the participants in that, again, is one way that we deliver value for our cloud customers.
I guess the other thing I would add too, and I'm so glad that Allan pointed this out, is this bubble chart that you're looking at right now. That's probably the most used graph that comes from TBR. I mean, our clients just grab that and say, this is how we can explain in one picture what's happening in our market, because you can see the revenue size, you can see the growth, and then you can see the operating margin. So the benchmarks are so foundational, just tremendously useful. I mean, as a use case, I guess it's silly to say. Next, let's talk about the real emerging use case that we're seeing now, and that's ecosystems. And so what ecosystem, the intelligence is for us, really, it's a combination of the two practices, my practice and Allan's practice. We're looking at the relationships between the IT services companies and the consultancies and the cloud and the software companies. We're looking at headcount, revenue estimates, again, making apples to apples comparisons by taking data that's out there publicly, data that we're able to model, estimates that we're able to make, and applying them into our own taxonomy. Who uses this? Well, of course, it's alliance leaders, as you can imagine, at all of the companies that we cover. And then it's also used by companies that are not in our coverage, where they can see the opportunities that might be out there for them, what the largest or the fastest growing players are doing in their ecosystem. And then sort of teeing off of that as well for the smaller ecosystem players, many, and this is super important, that many of the relationships we see are not just one-to-one. It's just not the tech partner with the SI firm. It's not just KPMG and Microsoft. There are multitudes of specialized players on both sides. So being able to see what that, for example, KPMG and Microsoft relationship looks like and being able to nurture that relationship across the entire spectrum is important, not just to the largest companies, but to the smaller companies that come to us. Anything else on this particular slide before we jump on?
Yeah, I think we'll get to a little bit more of it when we look at some of the voice of the customer and voice of the partner research that we do, because that's where that complexity comes up, that for end customers, they need a solution that involves not just, one or two providers. It's going to be a whole network of solutions that need to work together and be sold together. And so those types of relationships, again, that's one way we kind of round that out.
And so to do some use cases here, I've got two that I want to share that were really built on our ecosystem intelligence reports. The first one was a major consultancy, global consultancy, that looked at our ecosystem, our cloud ecosystem market landscape, and saw some of their competitors and the relationships that they have with the three hyperscalers, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and AWS. And this global consultancy said, where are we? How do we fit in? What can you say about us and our relationship so we can understand where we're falling short, whether it's from a capabilities, a delivery, a brand, a permission, what is it that we're missing? And so it was an opportunity for us to sit down with them and say, this is what your peers who are growing faster than you are actually doing. Here are the relationships they've built. Here are the go-to-market models they have with the hyperscalers that are allowing them to exceed the growth that this particular client of ours was realizing. That then turned into a much larger project, and we'll talk about projects and tailored services in a moment. But it really started with that foundational research that they were able to look at and say, wait, we recognize in this market landscape you provided us that we're not there, and we're not there because we're missing out on a few things that the others are doing better than we are. The second use case I want to talk about is a company that is transitioning from a value-added reseller into more of a services company. And that applies to seemingly every single value-added reseller we talk to right now, is they're all making that transition. And the ecosystem reports have been enormously important for them to, again, understand what are the companies they're trying to emulate doing now? What are the relationships that they built? What are the paths to go-to-market strategy? What are the paths to new opportunities with cloud and software providers that these much larger, much more mature companies have already done and have already shown are the best practices? So just using our report off the shelf, this VAR was able to adjust their strategy on how they went to market with and how they partnered with and what the commercial terms were with a number of the largest cloud companies and software companies. Allan, speaking of cloud companies and software companies.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we see with our cloud engagements is around just the pace of change in the market overall, that, whether the organization has been doing alliance and ecosystem activities for decades or whether they're relatively new, that, the technology is changing, the pricing and delivery is changing. And so all those things, we publish a lot of our reports quarterly, some twice a year. But the engagement, the pace is just much quicker than that. So doing the engagements around a report after it publishes, taking inquiry, that part, I think the pace is really accelerated in terms of, maintaining the ecosystem, not just setting it up. And it's good for a couple of years.
And any other particular use cases on this, on ecosystem intelligence?
Yeah,
we're going to get to that.
We're going to get to that, yep.
Okay, excellent. So last thing we want to highlight here in terms of use cases broadly. So again, it's benchmarking, which is totally foundational. Ecosystem intelligence, which is something that's evolved through looking at our practices together. And then there is tailored services. There is the opportunity for our clients to go deeper. And it really starts with that the ecosystem intelligence and the benchmarking. But then our clients develop these key intelligence questions based on their specific needs. And what's really essential aspect to this is why does TBR have the permission to do this kind of consulting? It's because TBR is we're looking at the business models, the strategies, the performances, so we can always provide context around specific initiatives, around specific challenges. We can provide context to what it means to the company overall. For example, you see on here this project around generative AI and pricing. Not only could we answer the specific questions around Gen AI and pricing and how that was changing, for a particular set of companies. But we could also say, because we follow those companies, how significant Gen AI was in terms of their revenue, in terms of their growth, in terms of different particular service lines within that company. So it's not just about getting to a specific answer to a question, it's about being able to put it in the broader context of the companies that we cover themselves. So our foundational research and analysis then provides the context for the deeper questions. And then some use cases, and we have over the year, I'm sure we have, Allan, favorite and non-favorite use cases that we have from the tailored services from the custom point of view. But I want to highlight from my perspective two in particular. One that I absolutely love. Our research begins, as I said before, with the companies themselves. So the companies that release their earnings, we release our report, our assessment of those earnings either that day or the next day. And then within a couple of weeks, we have a full breakdown where we tear apart the company, explain what's been going on, what's their strategy, what's changed in their business model, how their performance has been. So there's no better time to speak to an analyst here at TBR about any particular company than right after that company has released their earnings. That's when they're absolutely at the top of their game in terms of what is happening in a particular company. So one of our clients said, look, every quarter, can we just set up a couple of calls around the times of these earnings and have your analysts talk just for a few moments, 6-7 minutes tops, give us 2 or 3 things that happened in the last quarter, 2 or 3 things that surprised you about the company in the last quarter, and then 2 or 3 things you're thinking are going to be coming over the next quarter. And what was really important about this was not only were those calls beneficial to us in order to hear the questions, not only were those calls beneficial to the client because they got that very immediate and very refined analysis around what was happening with the company. The client themselves, it was salespeople primarily who were coming to these calls. Salespeople that know full well they need to compete against these competitors we were talking about, but salespeople who were not going to read a 60-slide deck, were not going to go through all the different nuances that we provide in our reports, really needed to know something right at the very top. What was the story about the company right now? What was something they could grab onto? So this came from the foundational research. This was entirely built on the stuff that we do every single quarter in every single company. But for this particular client, we had tailored the delivery of that analysis and that data to the very specific audience that they had. In this case, it was actually people in the cloud business of this company wanting to know what was happening with their SI, with their service partners, with their consultancy partners. So that example is one I absolutely love. Another one I really liked is a project we did for a hardware-centric services company that was trying to figure out how to sell more of their hardware to their services partners. And the thing I liked about this challenge in particular, and it was a huge challenge because we were trying to answer a question that they had, and we think the answer was the opposite of what they wanted it to be. And what I loved what came out of it was our ability to say, we understand the companies that you're trying to sell to so well that we understand what is really going to resonate with them and what they absolutely will never be interested in. And no matter how much you make that second part of the story sound great, and no matter how much you put yourself and your capabilities and your hardware at the front, it's simply not going to resonate. So here's the way to come at it in a different way. We were only able to do that because we had the context of understanding these companies, their business models, their sales motions, their go-to-market strategies. We understood all of that. So we weren't just answering the simple question of how can we get our partners to sell more? We were answering the much broader question was, how do we change the way that we approach selling with these partners in order to make it successful? Allan?
Yeah, one example that I included here, I think I appreciate it because of the element of tailoring it to their specific business. So very few companies that we cover play equally in every segment of whatever markets that they participate in. And they have niche competitors, they have broader competitors. And so getting to that standardization with the financial model to look at the areas that there is overlap and there's interest. And so cutting through some of the broader views that are included in our off-the-shelf research is a great example of what going to a tailored custom type engagement does. And then also the variety in terms of the outputs, the delivery models from kind of quick read, newsletter style analysis to calls to quantitative models to PowerPoint decks. It's all kind of rolled up in this one example, but it just shows you the breadth and the flexibility with which we can tailor what our financial view, our market view into the consumption model that fits our client.
Excellent.
Yeah, so we've gone through a lot already, but just taking a step back and saying, why does it matter? Why should we care? Specifically around the alliances and the ecosystem strategy, we've highlighted two examples, AWS and Microsoft Azure here, really big examples, obviously, but I think most of the vendors that we look at are planning on and already seeing more of their growth coming through the ecosystem, the indirect channels, the multi-vendor delivery of solutions is going to be a bigger factor for their business. And so this highlights it for those two vendors. You can see, within this year and definitely by next year, hundreds of billions of dollars for these two vendors at stake in terms of getting the ecosystem right, selling through that, participating with services vendors, ISVs, hardware OEMs, all that coming together. So the stakes are really high, and I think there's a big growth expectation across the board for vendors in the IT space that they need to do more through their ecosystem strategies, and that's going to be how growth is going to be delivered.
And I think one thing that changed the view of the importance of the ecosystem from the perspective of the SIs and the consultancies was when, and this was probably 5-6 years ago, there was a trend that emerged that clients were asking their cloud providers who they should go to for IT services, managed services, and consulting. So when it shifted from a McKinsey or a Deloitte recommending, hey, you should take your workloads to Azure, to the client saying to Microsoft Azure, hey, we want to take the next step with respect to cloud. We're going to need an implementation partner, or we're thinking about what cloud means to our business now. Who do you recommend for consulting? When that shift happened, that's when the SIs and the consultancies realized that playing in the ecosystem was going to require different set of skills, going to require a different mindset, different strategy, and the ecosystem became just that much more important.
Yep. And on the cloud vendor side, just to round out that thought, I think we saw a lot of, inbound inquiry around the cost savings, flexibility of cloud for, at least a decade. That shifted a bit. Now, once the phone stops ringing at the same frequency, you start to think about how can we go out and drive up solutions that are going to deliver that next phase of growth. And so that's
right.
Driving that interest in the ecosystem.
Not to mention the price and concern about, exactly. That's a whole separate webinar. So, all right.
Okay, great. So this highlights, I mentioned some of our voice of the customer and the voice of the partner research. So that rounds out. So we've gone through a lot of the kind of vendor-focused view of what their earnings are, how that segments in different markets. This really rounds out that research to go directly to end customers. We've done that research for a while, but just added this voice of the partner stream of research. So going out to some of the players in the ecosystem, the broad categories that we surveyed as part of that are listed out below. So kind of the hardware OEM side, the cloud and software vendors, and then the SIs. So, broadly covering most of the major groups in terms of the ecosystem view. And so this gives us insight in terms of the areas of focus for them, for their business across the different segments, where they're looking to invest and build skills and competency and business, as well as there's a whole area of actual vendor perception. So for some of the bigger SIs, for some of the bigger cloud vendors, who do they see as easier to work with, investing more in the right areas, and a better partner in terms of the ecosystem strategy for them. So we just published our first version of that fairly recently, and we're going to be doing more to kind of round out that view of the market. And we've seen a lot of engagement around that report already.
And one of the things that jumped out in that report for me was how far down the list everyone had generative AI. That in terms of the next 2 to 3 years where they saw growth, it wasn't with Gen AI. And that was across the OEMs, the cloud vendors, and the services vendors, which sort of was an indication of a saturation after all of the hype. But more importantly, it was, okay, now do we need to put from a services perspective, from a services company and consultancy's perspective, where do we need to put our resources? Well, we've done enough on Gen AI where the real opportunity is going to come, as you can see it on this chart here, that cloud migration.
Okay, great. And so similar to some of the views that Patrick showed earlier, which were from the perspective of the SI, I think it was Deloitte that we highlighted. This is the other view of the market. So from the cloud vendor out what does their ecosystem look like, what are the major kind of statistics that size that show the impact from a revenue perspective. And so we're really looking at it from putting ourselves in both sides of that relationship to understand the differences and how things are changing in terms of the ecosystem breadth. And again, having a quantitative view as the baseline for a lot of that research. And then on the qualitative side, this is included in the ongoing vendor reports as well as in the specific ecosystem reports. As I mentioned before, the pace of change, the areas of focus, the new deals that are being signed from an alliance and a ecosystem perspective. So digging below the numbers a bit into the qualitative aspects and getting real time with it is something that we're covering on an ongoing basis, and that a lot of our readership from an alliance perspective, really from every perspective, right? Because it is a core element of the growth strategy for the organization overall, for most of the vendors that we cover. Understanding what's new and changing and how that's represented in terms of segments and focus areas. This is an example of that for AWS. So Patrick mentioned some of the custom bespoke projects that we do that go a step further, but are still focused on kind of that overall alliance ecosystem strategy. So this is an output from an engagement we did with a large SaaS provider. And so they were evaluating their indirect investments. So across headcount, programs, technology, all the different, vehicles that those dollars can take the form of, getting a benchmark for how they compare, things that they should consider spending more in, investing less in, as well as kind of that story for each vendor, where they're at, where they're trying to get to, and what are the key things that our client can learn as a result of that. So it's definitely both a quantitative as well as a qualitative study. But this gives you a view for, these are all individual vendors with the two bars side by side for revenue versus investment in those indirect marketing programs. And so again, that's something that's very tailored, but actionable from a planning, budgeting, and then actual, operational strategy perspective. And then last example, this one's a little bit more qualitative, but it's all about, and I think we hear this from vendors of all different business models and sizes and backgrounds. What can I do to be a better partner? How can I stand out? How can I have a more compelling value proposition in the sea of different vendors that are competing for time and money, especially with some of the bigger technology vendors and services vendors that just attract a lot of attention, have a lot of established client relationships. And so this is one example, looking at SAP implementations, not just having the bodies to do work, but to focus and package intellectual property in a way that is compelling for end customers, makes for a better solution, less costly, highlights the value of the partner technology that they're bringing to the table. And so this type of landscape, I think, is just very operational, very actionable in terms of where to invest, how much to invest, and then how to go to market with it in a way that tightens that relationship with key partners.
So we're going to do some Q&A here. We did get a couple of questions in, and we're certainly going to stick around for a bit now. It's just been 30 minutes. We'll take some questions for a while. The first one was, please provide some examples of how mid-tier organizations use research to reshape their go-to-market strategy, which types of reports, stats, data, etc. I can speak, I'm going to list or mention a couple company names here and be very specific about it. Our cloud ecosystem market landscape, which I think we've renamed to the cloud ecosystem report or something. Yes. Yeah. That particular piece of research has, and we saw some clips of it or some snippets of it earlier. That particular piece of research has the relationships in terms of headcount and revenue and trained headcount, certified headcount, all that for Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and AWS with 11 global SIs or I should say 10 global SIs and then a consultancy, Deloitte. And so a mid-tier client of ours came to us and said, can we see the relationship between, they really wanted to focus on Accenture because Accenture tends to lead the market and tends to have best practices in a lot of ways. They wanted to look at Accenture. They wanted to look at another smaller company, and I believe it was Capgemini, if off the top of my head. And then, curiously enough, Deloitte, which does have a relationship with Microsoft Azure, despite the fact that they audit them and they can't go to market with them. But in any case, so what they were looking at specifically was how many trained resources they have, how many certified resources they have, what was the revenue that they could expect per trained or certified resource, what was the revenue that they were driving, each one of those kinds of companies. And then they wanted to take it the next step further, which was looking at the individual vendor reports on those companies to see what acquisitions had they made, where had they made them, were those acquisitions that were specific to Microsoft's, specific to an industry, or were those acquisitions made because they were in a particular market, a particular geo. What they did is they used both the cloud ecosystem report and the matrix that's in that, and then they paired that with the deep dives that are in the individual vendor reports to understand what the strategies were, what the thinking was behind Accenture and Deloitte and one other company in how they built up their Microsoft practice and how they were, most importantly, how they successfully built up their Microsoft practice. So it was a mix of specific data points. It was a mix of reports too, but it was all based on the just foundational research that we have. I don't know if you have any other examples of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously understanding, we've seen with the cloud vendors that a lot of them have kind of become hubs of the ecosystem. So there's, gaps that they're trying to fill, the business models, the value add elements that they're looking for the ecosystem for. So through tracking these vendors over time, understanding where they're investing, where they're looking for more, and then being able to provide that background for some of those partners helps in terms of approach, engagement, messaging.
And we've seen a lot around SAP in particular of late, really. So we've covered SAP for forever, and we've increased our understanding of the ecosystem relationships between the SIs and the consultancies and SAP. I mean, we always sort of knew, but we've kind of put that those two things together. So increasingly, the questions we're getting are not just on what's SAP doing or what's so-and-so doing with their SAP practice. It's how are they working together and where do they see the opportunity coming. We all know there's a deadline and all that, but there's a lot of other work out there for SAP.
Right. And a lot of the new SAP customers are net new. They're smaller than they ever have been. They're some of the people that are growing their SAP practice. I think we're surprising that we work directly with. It's not always your traditional big SI, global SI that's doing a lot of that work. So it is definitely a new area of opportunity, specifically around SAP, but you could translate that to other vendors as well.
Yeah. And we have, off the shelf right now, we have ecosystem intelligence reports for, and I'll just name the cloud and the software vendors because it's a little bit different report by report on the services and consultancy side. But for the cloud and software vendors, we have Salesforce and Adobe, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and AWS, and SAP, Oracle, and Workday. So, and that last one, SAP, Oracle, and Workday, is where we probably have the most variation in terms of the companies that are covered outside of those other traditional largest SIs and consultancies. Another question we got, and I think based on the timing that this came in, it had to do with the quarterly readouts that I was talking about, is how much would building a program like this cost for us? Well, I don't know who the us is exactly, but and I'm not the sales guy here in the room, and neither are you, Allan, but I will answer that. So our research is sold on a seat basis or up to an enterprise access. So enterprise access meaning everybody in a company can have access to it. So I can't really say for certain what it would cost to build something like that. We can certainly take that offline. We'll figure out how to do that and get back to you. Any other questions that you have for me, I have for you? Because I think that's pretty much it in the chat, unless anybody, this is your chance to weigh in one more time before we wrap up here. Any other things on your mind on this?
No, a question we get a lot is how do you decide who to cover?
Oh, that is a good question.
Which is always a good one.
Well, you can answer that.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, so obviously, and especially with the ecosystem, the large alliances is where a lot of the revenue is accounted for. So from our financial view, we always start there. But a lot of it is driven by client interest and feedback. And so even if it's not in the report, we can take that same lens and apply it in a pretty lightweight way for different participants in an ecosystem and provide insight. And so I think that interaction I found to be very helpful in terms of guiding. If you hear it from 3 different clients, then it's a pretty good assumption more want to learn about that particular vendor.
Yeah, and in my experience on the services side, honestly, we have in the last couple of years done so much more work with clients who are not companies that we cover. So I know more about Intel and Dell now than I ever thought I would. I know more about Amdocs. I know more about Logicalis. I know more about all these companies that are not in my immediate practice, but because the companies that we work, that are clients of ours that are in the IT global SIs and the consultancies, because those companies are coming to us and asking questions outside of the sphere of their own immediate space. But then also the Intels of the world and the Dells and the Microsofts are coming to us and saying, tell us more about those companies that you cover. So I end up, it's not a direct answer to the question about how do you decide who we cover. I end up just seeing such a much broader span of the world because of the questions that are coming to us from our clients, which is both fascinating but really hard to keep up with.
Yeah. I mean, I think the traditional categorization of vendors in the IT space is blurred. I think it's a reflection of that. You have SIs that act like ISVs. You have resellers that act like MSPs. Not like there's the activities are spread across.
Yeah. All right. We did get one more question in. It's along the same lines as the pricing before. It's what of this is available in standard research and how much does standard research package access cost? Again, it depends on the scope of the license. We have some clients that are seat by seat. We have most of our clients that are enterprise access meaning everybody in a company has access to all of our stuff. In the past, I'll just say this, we used to be more siloed along the different practices. So we had clients who simply had access to research in my practice or simply Allan's practice or the other 5 practices. That's not the case anymore. For the most part, all of our clients now have access to research across all of the practices within TBR because our silos don't matter. It's their ecosystem. It's their competitive environment. Their meaning our clients. It's our clients' competitive environment that matters. And it doesn't do any good to read our Accenture report if you don't read Allan's SAP report, if that's the space that you're competing in, you're operating in. So again, we'll get back to you on individually on that particular question, but the broad answer is it's seat by seat or enterprise access. And the vast majority of the research that we do is published on a regular basis. The tailored, customized consulting projects that Allan and I talked about, that is not the majority of our work. The majority of our work is the stuff that we crank out. As I mentioned, a company releases its earnings, we're on top of it, and within 24 hours, we've got our assessment, 2 weeks later, the full assessment. So that's what we have. Yeah. Anything else, Allan?
No.
All right, thanks. Next week, I'll be speaking with Boz Hristov about Fujitsu's recent analyst event in California. Don't forget to send us your key intelligence questions on business strategy, ecosystems, and management consulting through the form in the show notes below. Visit tbri.com to learn how we help tech companies large and small answer these questions with the research, data, and analysis my guests bring to this conversation every week. Once again, I'm your host, Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst at TBR. Thanks for joining us and see you next week.